Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education, and we employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers and make classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Well, today in our Kepler Conversation, I'm joined by Kepler teacher Rocky Ramsey. Rocky lives in Indianapolis, Indiana with his lovely wife and daughter, where he works as an environmental consultant. And he completed his undergraduate work at Indiana University, Bloomington, earning a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science. And he obtained a Master's of Science in Ecological and Environmental Engineering at Purdue University. His research focuses on landfill technology-based application for carbon sequestration. To sequester it, I guess. Rocky earnestly desires to see Christians more thoroughly equipped to handle the climate alarmism and equip students with the ability to rebut modern environmental religion with a sober-minded view of God's creation. Welcome, Rocky. Glad to have you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Postma. Pleasure to be here.
I almost want to, when I read that climate alarmism, I almost wanted to get my really angry face on and yell, "How dare you!" Point my finger or something. But
bring that up. It's a very hot button topic right now, so there will be a lot of fingers wagging for sure.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Well, listen, as we get started, one of the things I'd love to do with our Kepler teachers in these conversations is get to know you just a little bit, and maybe you could tell us something about yourself. Who's Rocky outside of the classroom? What are your hobbies? What do you like to do? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, glad to. So, from the bio, I'm from Indianapolis, and I work as an environmental consultant for my day-to-day vocation. A lot of the things I'm wrapped up in right now are just crafting these courses that I'm going to be teaching for the first time. So I'm doing a ton of reading right now. I've always love to read. So that's like my main hobby. I'm always reading, listening to audiobooks, trying to redeem the time when I have extra time, playing with my daughter, hanging out with her. We have another one on the way. So just trying to be a godly family man, spend time with my wife and child. I'm helping with a church plant right now. It's a CREC church plant in Indianapolis. We'd be the first one there. First CREC church in Indianapolis. There's only one other CREC church in Indiana. So I'm a part of that church plant and I help preaching, I do preaching. So that's my free time, honestly, just a ton of reading, hanging out with my family, seeing friends, inviting people over to the house to have dinner, talking about theology, that sort of thing.
Hey, it sounds like a great life of the mind for sure. And congratulations on the new little one on the way. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, as classical educators, sometimes I've discovered over the years that a lot of classical educators, fall in love with classical education, either because they obviously had a classical education themselves, or it's just the opposite, recognizing that, maybe like as in my case, public school education lacked so terribly that when I discovered classical education, it just, I became hungry. But maybe you'd talk a little bit about your educational background and what brought you to study what you're studying.
Yeah. So I was not even raised in a Christian household. I mean, I grew up unbeliever, didn't know Christ, and started following Christ my junior year of high school. And then ever since just been growing and maturing, and thankful to be in the Lord, be united to him, be united to Christ. So when I became a Christian, I started to read, right? Because we're people of the book as Christians. We love books, and particularly the book, God's inspired, infallible word. And through that love of that book, I started to just read more in general because I just became interested in the world. I was no longer apathetic and didn't care about anything. Rather than being like driven by vice and just what I desired, I finally was interested in other things, and particularly the Lord and the world he had made. So I started reading, and I got really invested in theology, but then I became a Reformed Christian and started realizing, all of Christ for all of life. Wait a second. Theology is not just like necessarily just reading theological text or treatises, having pie in the sky all the time, but everything we do as Christians is theological in nature, or needs to be contextualized in a Christian worldview. So that led me to classical Christian education. That's the point I'm trying to draw out here. I was disenfranchised with my public education. It didn't really ignite my heart to desire to learn about the world. But once I became a Christian, I was actually interested in God's creation. So then I started learning about the world. Here comes classical Christian education, particularly through Kepler. That's how I really got turned on to it, just taking micro courses with you guys, and all the preceptorials, and learning a lot from you all. And so it's been about 3 years I've been into classical Christian education, learning about it. First book was The Gateway Drug, Doug Wilson, Lost Tools of Learning. All of his books, right? He gets everybody into a lot of different topics, and he's the one that introduced me to classical Christian education. So I see it as a much needed reformation in education in general that actually stokes curiosity, adoration, love for just learning in general. It gives you the tools of learning, but then also it's particularly Christian, which is much needed to even have a heart to desire everything else, right? Because for me, that was my journey of learning, is becoming a Christian is what set me on the path of learning. So I think that's how I'd respond to that.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic response, and I love that you, as you talked about, becoming a Christian, all of a sudden, the world and your studies, all those things became far more interesting, and it's just the sort of idea of enchantment is the way I think of it. It's all of a sudden there's meaning to all of this, and so I love that, and that integrated aspect of education is not just some compartmentalized, thing that we do to try to, get a bunch of knowledge in our head, but rather how we bring this theory down to, theology is, the study of God, but bring it down to from 30,000 feet, to how we live out our life every day. And in your case, environmental science and those things would make the most sense that you would love creation and natural philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you're teaching a couple of courses, and honestly, I know I say this about several of our teachers. I look at the courses, and I just wish I had more time, because I would love to jump into a couple of these classes that you're teaching. And so you're teaching natural philosophy of creation, and you're teaching creation and the classics, which I love both those titles. Can you unpack those a little bit? Like, what are students going to be diving into?
Yeah.
What are they learning? What's the point of these classes, or their objective?
Yeah. So you're welcome to go see how I've described this in a brief way on Kepler's website, the description of the course. If I were to describe it to somebody to pique your interest, what I'm trying to do with these two courses is I want to, as the humanists did during the Reformation, the Renaissance, going ad fontes back to the sources, there was a very sharp distinction in the way your average person, or even your intellectual, would view nature during the Enlightenment. There's a sharp distinction there, and then you have post-Enlightenment view of nature, and then you have like a pre-Enlightenment view of nature, which would be like the classical view of nature. Okay, so Christian humanism never had a chance to address your view of nature, because there was no need to when the Renaissance and the Reformation actually happened, because there was still a continuous view of nature up until that point, and there were different issues that needed to be addressed ad fontes, going back to the sources. So what my course is doing, I'll start with the natural philosophy of creation, because that's like my flagship, my main thing. It's my little baby. I've been cultivating it for a long time, and I've loved working on that. The goal of that course is the first half would be explicitly a natural philosophy course, going back to the sources, starting with the first couple units are looking at the Bible's use of nature. And particularly, we're going to look at how the command to work and keep the garden, what those words in Hebrew actually means. And it's includes things like it was almost like they were commanded to dress the garden, to put clothing on the garden, to clothe the garden, to basically just beautify it and glorify it by actually cultivating it and doing something, adding as image bearers onto what the garden was, and then to go out from there and extend the borders of the garden. And I think that the first couple of chapters of Genesis have some foundational principles that Christians need to adopt and always have in their minds when they're approaching nature or hearing somebody talk about nature. That's kind of everything is in Genesis. So I start there in the class, and we kind of build that foundation in Genesis of how God created everything and how we're supposed to interact with it. And then we go do a whole one unit over looking at how the Bible uses nature as a symbolism. So that's where I start talking about how the Bible enchants nature. You already brought up that term. I think that's an important term. So the course kind of begins with re-enchanting it in a biblical worldview, our view of nature. The Bible, and I think a really easy to understand example, it would be Jesus's parable on the kingdom of God being like a mustard seed. That's he's giving you a little lesson on biology, on how the mustard seed as a thing that God made operates, and then using it as a symbol or as a metaphor or an analogy for what the kingdom of God is like. So what would happen if the mustard seed goes extinct? Right? What would happen? It would be very difficult. We'd have to kind of harken back to what we used to know about that bit of biology, that piece of life that God had created, to understand what the analogy is. So I kind of pose questions like that, like how does God use nature in a symbolic manner? And how does it point to him and point to truth? So that would be how the course starts. And then we look at the church fathers and how they viewed nature, exegeting the Bible. So we read St. Basil and St. Augustine on Genesis, some early what they call a hexameron, and all that means for the etymology of the word, you have the prefix hex for 6, and it's just then ameron is the days. So the study of the 6 days is what a hexameron was, and there were hundreds of these hexamerons. It's just a commentary on Genesis. That's all it is. There was hundreds of them in the ancient world and antiquity. And I select a few of the most popular ones and the ones that I think display the Bible the best. We go through a couple of hexamerons. Then we look at the classical world, so the Greeks and the Romans. We read Pliny the Elder. We read Aristotle's Physics, which is where we get the term nature from. The physis is the Greek word that in Latin is translated as natura, which would be natural or nature. So we look at how Aristotle was viewing nature. We can think of the book Physics. We could insert the word nature in English. That would be if we had we could also use nature rather than physics. And it's his natural philosophy of the created world. So we go through that. We look at Plato's Timaeus, where he gives some natural philosophy as well in his Timaeus. And then after that, we look at the medieval age. We look at the reformers and the Renaissance and humanism. And then we kind of have a sharp break in the 8th week, I think, on looking at modernity. We talk about Spinoza and Darwin, Hume, a lot of these new Enlightenment philosophers. And my goal of that class is to basically disenchant everybody. And all the students should leave that class saying, wow, if this is true about how we view the world, this is bleak, because it's just materialism. And then after that, we kind of we have now the framework at that point, and then we look at the modern view of nature and expand it into how it's applied, how this disenchanted natural philosophy is now applied in various realms in our society now. So we look at climate change, we look at economics, we look at environmental legislation, we look at the birth of the EPA and what's going on here. We look at how we would view the image of God and humanity being a blessing on earth versus what would be called like a neo-Malthusian view of humans being a blight on the earth. So those are some of the big topics we're talking about in that first section. The second half of the course, we've laid all that groundwork. We've looked at like the natural philosophy of antiquity all the way up to the modern natural philosophy. And then we now start to transition to something more practical, and it would be the equivalent of an AP environmental science course, but it's in the context of permaculture, which is a discipline of agriculture. Okay. And the reason why I think that's important and why I'm teaching AP environmental science in the context of agriculture, the pithiest, most easy way I could describe it would be the first form of culture is agriculture. And that you can read that in Will Durant's History of Civilization. He makes that statement when he talks about how civilization grew. That's the first form of culture. We started out as agriculture, doing agriculture as humanity. That's what we engaged in, working with the ground. And then Wendell Berry says the same thing in his essays on agriculture. And this is also just implicit in where Genesis starts. They start in the garden, and God says, go and work and keep the garden, go engage in agriculture. So I'm just basically taking my cue from the Bible, and I'm going to show, applying natural philosophy properly, the culture that is flowers out of that is rooted in agriculture, our relation to the dirt, because we are from dirt. We are Adam. We are man. We come from the dirt. Therefore, we ought to understand and know how to cultivate the dirt properly, and not destroy or dominate the earth or the soil per se. Because it's kind of like we're spitting on ourselves because we're made from the dirt, and we will go back to being dirt. So we need to be able to interact with dirt properly. So that's why I'm teaching that last course from the angle of permaculture. Some of the topics covered there would just be your classic topics in an AP environmental science course: biogeochemical cycles, conservation biology, population dynamics, those sorts of things. Those are going to be some like big topics we talk about. Okay, so I'll stop now. That was a lot, but that's kind of that course. And then if there's anything you want to interact with, I can talk about my summer course I made.
Well, I'll just say this: you sold me. I mean, that sounds like such a phenomenal course of study. I can't imagine anybody walking away from that without having this really robust understanding of our place, here on in the cosmos, on the planet.
Awesome.
Yeah, kudos. That sounds like an amazing course. And then, so are you teaching a summer version of that? Is that what you were just saying?
So the summer course, my goal with that is the environmental movement is huge right now. It's one of the main pillars of what I would say is government overreach, or the entry point to kind of control our lives, and particularly to control education. It's pretty much it's a golden calf of, you need to educate the next generation in the realities of what they would call climate catastrophism, or like doomsdayism of their view of climate change. You have to activate the next generation in order to do the things that they want to do. And because it's a global problem, the solution is a centralized global government response. Okay. So you have to get the next generation on board. So the summer course is, we just had this major shift in our view of nature in the last 150 years. Are there any classical works that were grappling with that shift during that time span? And can it inform us on how we're trying to view it as Christians? And can we kind of get back to see the thought process in the classical works? And I have found and selected 3 classical works to kind of trace that thought. And the first one is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. He was a transcendentalist. That's where you start getting a view of nature that's very like pantheistic and Eastern, kind of like a oneness with nature. So your goal when you go out into nature is to, detect something intuitively about yourself, your connection with nature. Okay. So that's, Henry David Thoreau, he goes out to Walden Pond and he lives there for a few years and, discovers all sorts of things about how bad society is, all the assumptions we have about society, and how we need to kind of, go more into nature in order to truly be human. And there's some nuggets of truth in there. There's some great thoughts he has, but then we also need to dissect it as Christians and decipher what's correct about his thought process. The second book is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgkin Burnett. And she starts to grapple with theosophy and new thought and Christian science, and which are kind of offshoots of transcendentalism. They're like adjacent to transcendentalism, but they kind of deal with nature in a different way. It's more geared towards like nature as healing, being out in nature or being connected to the world, the oneness of the world is how you can find healing. And it's through your mind connecting to the world. It's very mind driven. Like if I think the right thoughts, then I will be healthy. I will be good. We even see inklings of this in the Pentecostal movement with the Word of Faith movement is a development of theosophy and new thought and Christian science in the Pentecostal movement. Okay, so that's the second book. And then the last book, we're going in chronological order, by the way. So Walden's early 19th century, and then we get turn of the 20th century is Frances Hodgkin Burnett. And then a little bit after her, like 1 year actually, is this book by Jean Stratton Porter. She is a naturalist, a Christian naturalist from Indiana, actually, which is where I'm from. And she lived in northern Indiana, and she wrote this book called The Harvester. And there's some really, really good stuff about how to interact with nature and how we should view nature. She was, developing a view of nature in this fictional work. And I really love the book. The story's good, but there's also some good things to extract about the natural world from it. So those are the three works we do. It's basically zooming in on that, the one unit in my natural philosophy of creation course. We're zooming in on that sharp change in the view of nature. And we're seeing if there's what are some books that are after that as it's developing. So that's the goal of those courses. And I'm really excited to teach them.
That's phenomenal. And then you have one other in the fall, right? Creation and classics. Is that different than your summer course?
That is the same thing. That is the summer course.
Okay, that is the summer course. Sorry, I got that one off. So that's excellent. That'll be fun. That'll be fun summer reading for students and diving into some of these things. So I hope so. Besides convincing a nerd like me that this is a class I want to take. And I mean that in the best possible way. Like I love Wendell Berry. I love this idea of how as Christians we view this world, and especially in a time when, as you just mentioned, we're in a culture of pantheistic sort of nature worshiping, in the preservation movement, I'm not sure of all these terms. We're going to talk about this on the 30th. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. But seeing how this has been approached and you're unpacking a wonderful Christian worldview. Can you give us just a little nugget as we're kind of winding down our time here together, maybe just leave a little nugget that might just be interesting that folks would love to connect with and get a taste of this course?
Yes. First, I want to make a comment on how it's not appealing to just a nerdy person. Okay. This is something God's put in the world, these symbols for him all over the place. We are made to be in this world. We're supposed to be here. Okay. And God's going to renew the whole earth. Okay. So if this course is designed to re-enchant nature and to get back to how humanity used to view nature, and it was a glorious thing when we were not in harmony with nature in the sense that like a pantheist might say that, but we were there was a time where we had a correct view of nature, and all around us were these teachings of who God is, and we could see the glory of God. So this would be like common grace or natural revelation, natural theology, natural law, all those things. Okay. That used to be a part of our view of nature. So this course is trying to get back to that. It's immensely practical because it should be meditative. It should be contemplative for the student as we re-enchant nature. Okay. Now, some of like interesting things we'll be reading that I find super fascinating. We are going to read Pliny the Elder, who actually died in the volcano Vesuvius that blew up with Pompeii. Okay. He was a Roman general that died in that volcanic explosion. But what he did on his side, his side business or side hustle, whatever you want to call it, was just being a natural historian. Okay. So he was a general, a Roman general by day. And as he would go on his campaigns, he was acquiring all sorts of information about the natural world. We're going to read some excerpts on some of the things he found, okay, in the natural world. And we're just going to, take his word for it, right? Because he wrote it and he's the author. And one of the things that he discusses is the existence of dragons. He talks about all sorts of other things. He will mix in, he will be talking about a hippopotamus and go through the natural history of a hippopotamus and what he knows about a hippopotamus. And then he will turn to dragons. And then he'll talk about the crocodile. And then he'll talk about the basilisk. And then he'll talk about, so basically he goes from what we would view a mythological creature to a creature that we just know still exists today, right? So he kind of toggles back and forth, and we're going to read some of his thoughts, and he's actually on point on a lot of the creatures that we're aware of now that we've done, we've studied and done research on. He has really interesting things to say, but he also, as he talks about dragons, there's a lot of spiritual implications to what he's saying, and he recognizes that animals are not just automatons in the world that God made. They point back to something spiritual. They have a spiritual element to them. So we're going to talk about dragons and, what he believes about dragons and how dragons interact in their environment and what they eat and how they live and how they mate, and then we'll talk about elephants and his view of elephants and what he knew about elephants. And there's all sorts of interesting spiritual things mixed in. He talks about the lion being courageous, and everybody knows they're courageous, right? They're a symbol of courage. They're a symbol of honor. And he talks about all of that. So that's a book that I'm really excited to see what students have to say and how they enjoy it. So that's a little interesting tidbit about the course that I'm excited about.
I love it. When you look at, Tolkien or any of these who are fantasy writers, and their understanding of medieval and Norse and all of that, the dragon doesn't seem to be so far off as we think in our mind. But to hear this Roman general, writing about things that we would just take for granted, right? The rhinoceros or the hippopotamus and the elephant, and dragons are right in the middle of it, So
Yep.
It's ought to be very fascinating. Rocky, thank you. I know we're out of time. I could continue to talk about these things and ask you a ton of questions. I'm going to put all of the links to Rocky's courses in the show notes. I hope you'll come by and at Kepler.education, check out his courses, and his contact information is there if you have any questions. And Rocky, thanks so much. It was great visiting with you today.
Likewise. Thank you, Dr. Postma.
All right. God bless all.